Your change focus is almost certainly out of whack. You've developed a dangerous muscle imbalance. You've got an overdeveloped bicep solving problems and an underdeveloped bicep seeking success. While you're worrying about dumpster fires, there are probably change secrets hiding in plain sight. Dan Heath is about to reveal how seeking bright spots, not problems, is what really creates change momentum. It's a counterintuitive process that can make you look like a change genius. Here we go. I'm Michael Bungay-Stanier. This is Change Signal, the podcast where we cut through the blather, the BS and the noise to find the good stuff that works in change management. Two books influenced me when I first started wading into the world of change. One was William Bridges' book, Transitions. Really, it was the first change book that got handed to me when I was a brand new consultant. And therefore, the first time I really understood there was thinking and models and philosophies and structure behind change. And as a small boast, I got to write the introduction to the 40th edition of that book, which really felt like a complete honor, a closing of the circle. But, the book that really opened my head and my heart was by Chip and Dan Heath. And it's called Switch, How to Change Things When Change is Hard. I read that book and I felt, A, this tells me more about change than I've ever known before. And B, it tells me story and it gives me metaphors that I will remember and quote for the rest of my life. And C, wow, I wish I could write books like this. So Switch has been on my shelves for 15 years since it came out in 2010. And you can probably imagine I was a little excited to discover Dan Heath has written a new book on change. It's called Reset, How to Change What's Not Working. I've read it. I love it. It's already one of my favorite change books. So what an absolute treat to have him on the podcast with us. Dan, welcome.
Thank you so much, Michael. What a kind introduction. I appreciate that.
It's 15 years since Switch came out. How has your perspective on change and what makes change work shifted in those 15 years?
I think what prompted me to write Reset, which in many ways is a sister book to Switch, because they're both squarely on the topic of change. But as you know, Switch is approaching change through the lens of behavior change.
Right.
And I think in the intervening years, I've had a lot of occasion to talk to people about change, work with them on change. And I felt like there was a systems layer that was complementary to the behavior change layer. And so Reset is really a reapproach to change through the lens of systems change, through the lens of operations and strategy. So it's almost like two different altitudes on the same topic.
Reset starts with a very essential idea, which is go find leverage points. What is that about? What does that mean?
So the big idea here is that, in complicated times of change, and they're always complicated, you just can't do everything at once. You can't do most things. You probably can't even do a significant fraction of things, but you can do something. There is something you can control, which of course puts a lot of importance on the something that you pick. And so that becomes a departure point for the book, is that when we're trying to change systems, let's find a leverage point within the system, a place where, a little bit of investment yields a disproportionate return. And of course, that sounds easy. Wouldn't we all like to have places where a little bit goes a long way? And so fully half of the book is about that search, because it's not trivial to find these things. And so I go through tools or approaches for locating these mythical leverage points.
Well, we'll start off by telling me where people get it wrong. I mean, how do people miss this opportunity?
I think a lot of times what happens is, number one, we lose sight of the fact that change is possible.
Right.
Michael Jordan had this great quote I remember from years ago where he said, everybody says practice makes perfect. But that's actually not true. He said practice makes permanent. So, if you practice the wrong way of shooting a free throw 5,000 times, like you've just made yourself really good at shooting a free throw the wrong way.
Right.
And I think that's what happens a lot of times in teams. Like the very first story in the book is about this this team within a hospital in the receiving area. It's their job to get packages that have been ordered to their ultimate destination in the hospital. And for as long as anyone can remember, it's taken them an average of 3 days to get these packages deployed.
Right.
And from an outsider's point of view, that just sounds nuts, right? FedEx can get the package across the country in 1 day, and then it takes 3 days to get it from like the basement to the third floor.
Yeah.
But from within the department, I mean, all the evidence they have says that's the way the world works. They come to work every day. They work hard. They're not lazy. They're not dumb. It's just that's what's possible. And in this case, it took an outsider coming in, a guy named Paul Suet, to come in and make them rethink a lot of assumptions. And the first thing he does, which, by the way, I think is a secret of effective organizational change, is you've got to work through your team. And first, he checks in with them. Like, if we can make this work flow more smoothly, we can get packages delivered more quickly, which will help your colleagues in the hospital, and do all that without adding any more labor from your side. Like, are you with me? And that becomes, the first check-in. And they say, yeah, we're with you.
Before Dan continues with the story, this is worth just hitting pause on. Are you with me? I think it's a question we often forget to ask as change leaders. We just hope for the best, or we assume, or we stay in denial. So for your executive team, for your change sponsor, for your change team, for the people you're inviting to change, are you with me? And remember, wait and hear the answer. Yes, we're with you. Or maybe, no, we're not with you yet, because that tells you what should happen next.
So Suet invites them along to kind of diagnose the problem. So they spend an hour a day together for 12 business days in a row, just walking the line from where the UPS and FedEx trucks come in to through all the stages in the process to the ultimate delivery points at the hospital. And they're just looking, right? They're looking, where are the delays? Where did things get held up? And long story short, the number one thing that they find that's holding back packages is a kind of misuse of batching processes.
Mm-hmm.
So batching is just the idea. You kind of wait for a bunch of stuff to pile up before you do the thing, like laundry. Nobody washes like one sock at a time and then goes to the other sock. You wait to get a proper pile and then you put it in. That's batching. And so in a lot of cases, batching can be quite efficient. And so they had introduced a lot of batching stages thinking that was efficient. Maybe you wait for a pile of packages before you zap them into inventory so you can just go boop, 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 boop.
Mm.
But as Suet pointed out, there was no real organic reason to ever wait for the batch. Like he said, we should think of this as a process where packages flow like a river from origin to destination. And anywhere there's a delay, anywhere there's a holdup, we should be removing that friction. In 6 weeks, they cut the delays in half. In 12 weeks, they are delivering 90% of these packages within the same day. I mean, just
so good.
Miraculous results in like 12 weeks, right? It didn't take 4 years in a McKinsey consulting project. But it did take that kind of shakeup of the view of the system, and it did take a really careful exploration for leverage points.
If I've walked the line, I've seen the work, and I'm looking for leverage points, and perhaps I've started to notice something. Is that enough, or is there more to do?
We're talking about the search for leverage points. And so one strategy, as you said, is to go and see the work, meaning, get closer to the work, walk the line in the receiving area like Paul Suet did. Another strategy is to ask yourself, what's the best of what's possible today, and how can we do more of that?
Yeah.
Very simple idea. I'm going to call studying the bright spots. And the idea here is a lot of times leaders are at such a high level that they have to trade off depth for breadth. It's like their purview increases, their scope increases. And so then all of a sudden you're kind of managing by rolled up numbers, aggregates and averages, like revenue is an aggregate and profit is an average and net promoter score is an average.
Right.
And so you're getting these indicators. But to really understand and diagnose what's happening, you've got to kind of tease that apart. So in the book, there's a story of a guy named Ken Davis at Gartner.
So just to jump in, Gartner's a consultancy and does research and gives advice to executives, especially in the world of tech. You may even have heard of the Gartner hype cycle and their magic quadrant model, if you want to go down that particular rabbit hole.
Ken Davis comes in at a point where Gartner's retention is just in the toilet. This is post-Great Recession. And of course, in a subscription business, like retention is the thing that you have to move.
Exactly.
And so his first instinct, there's a bunch of stuff that's wrong. I mean, he literally had some people managing retention who were keeping about 25 cents on the dollar of what happened last year. I mean, there were some dumpster fires that he could have spent all his time putting out. Instead, his attention is drawn. There's like a small group, maybe 8 or 10% of his retention folks who have perfect retention, even in the face of all this economic hardship. Those are the bright spots. And he got curious, how are they doing it?
Yeah.
And so they just literally start studying their own people. Like, what are our best performers doing behaviorally on a day-to-day basis that our worst performers aren't? And they start surfacing all these very, very practical things. Like the best performers tended to have very disciplined calendar management. They had to make a lot of outgoing calls. So they would say, first thing in the morning, I'm going to get 10 calls on the books. I'm going to, leave time for reschedules and callbacks. And those are things you can teach, right? It wasn't their inborn charmingness that was making them more effective, right? It was these specific things that they had learned to do. And so Ken gets them to train up the other reps. I mean, they make a massive difference in retention in a very short period of time just by looking at their own bright spots. And go ahead.
How does this help with resistance to change? What is it about bright spots that helps kind of sneak around or dissolve some of that resistance?
I think bright spots and the leverage points that they surface add clarity. And I think, as my brother and I say in Switch, what looks like resistance is often a lack of clarity. That when people aren't sure what it's going to take to succeed, that can manifest as anxiety or resistance. And so, when Ken Davis, imagine you're one of the C or D performers for Ken Davis in this period. Like you're worried about your job.
Yeah.
But you're not really sure how to get better. It's not like you've been coming to work and just, goofing off the whole day.
Right.
And then when Ken Davis comes to you and says, hey, can you try this thing where you organize your calendar this way and make 10 calls in the morning? Well, that doesn't sound threatening.
Right.
That doesn't sound scary. And so as long as, and then this is something else that I learned from Ken, he said, as long as people wanted to get better, I felt 100% confident they could get better. Like I could help them.
Yeah.
He said, now there was a percentage of people who just had a philosophical objection to the approach. It's like, well, he told me about this one person that he interviewed around that time. And well, I'm not really in the business of just logging more time on the phone with clients. Like I'm more of a strategist. And he was well,
I'm an artist, darling. Don't you know?
Yeah, that's right. And he said, and so he had this quote that stuck with me, in change situations, you can either change the people or change the people. Right. And I think we should be honest about that. I mean, it's not all happy stories. But I think the vast majority of the success he had was through the lever of showing people how to do better work. And then, a margin was figuring out they had the wrong people.
For me, Dan, it's also that these are homegrown wisdom taught within the system rather than brought in from outside the system. Because as somebody who's often outside the system, there's nothing more annoying than somebody who shows up going, hey, I'm a consultant. Let me tell you my awesome stuff. You should just rework your core things. And they're like, well, who are you? And why would you even know this? Mm-hmm. But part of the wisdom of this is that it is internal people teaching internal people. And that's one of the hidden secrets to bright spots that I think really can help change stick. And jumping in here, just to go a little deeper, Dan's idea of bright spots draws on some change philosophies that I know and admire, appreciative inquiry for one, and a particular favorite of mine, positive deviance. William Gibson said that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. Bright spots is saying, go find that future because it's already arrived. Part of the challenge around bright spots is the dumpster fire keeps burning. even as you focus on the bright spots. How, in your experience, have you helped people overcome their biological urges to go fix the broken thing?
It's really, really hard. And, the way I try to argue the case to leaders is we have what I consider to be twin muscles. It's like two biceps. And one bicep is the problem-solving bicep. That's the dumpster fire chasing bicep. And we work that thing all the time. It's like we go to the gym and we do 1,000,000 curls. And so we've got one bicep that's just jacked.
Yeah.
And then we've got another bicep that's the success spotting and reproducing bicep that is just sad and weak and flaccid because of, lack of use. But their potential power is exactly the same.
Yeah.
Right? In any situation, you can either dwell more on what's not working or more on what is working. And if you think conceptually about it, my argument is, if you solve problems, that's great. You fix the problems. If you reverse engineer successes, you can often find the seeds there to shift the entire system in a positive direction. Like you think about employee engagement.
Yeah.
Anybody who's looking at employee engagement data is seeing mixed data. There's some employees are really engaged, some that are sort of engaged, some that are not engaged. Your attention goes to the disengaged, obviously. But what I'm saying is if you can just shift some of your attention to trying to understand why your most engaged employees are the most engaged, you're probably going to learn something that lets you boost the entire curve, in a positive direction. Versus, I do not think you can make the same case on the problem side. You might fix individual problems, but you're probably not improving the system.
Dan teaches two core ideas in this new book about change. And we've already touched on one, which is finding the leverage points. The second core idea is how to stack resources. Dan, in your book, Reset, it's broken into two core parts. The first part we've been talking about, the find leverage points. The second core concept here is to stack resources. So let's dig into that. Where do we start with stacking resources? And maybe even start telling me, well, why is this so important?
Yeah, well, I think the simplest way I can describe it is whatever problem you're trying to solve, the way that you have organized your resources today is yielding that problem. There's a quote that I love from Paul Batalden that says, every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. So just sit with that for a second. That means
it's so good. Oh my God. It kind of melts your brain when you think about it.
I know. I mean, ever since I heard that, it has just been in RAM in my brain ever since. But it's just brilliant because it says that, an object in motion stays in motion. Like if you don't change the way you're using resources, you cannot expect the outcomes to change.
Right.
And so often we approach change as if it's an and. Like we're gonna do all the things we're doing, and we're gonna get more customer centric, or we're gonna be more inclusive, or whatever. And so the argument I'm making in the book is it's better, it's smarter to think of change as an instead of an and. Meaning there has to be some tangible sense of we're taking resources and shifting them in a way that gets us closer to those leverage points we talked about. So that's the notion of restacking resources.
Yeah.
And the painful part about leverage points is where are you going to find these things? Because if it were easy, you would have already found them.
Yeah.
And then the painful thing about restacking resources is people do not like trade-offs,
Right.
There's probably nobody on your team that thinks, well, everything I'm doing is worthless, so you can harvest my time for your change effort.
Right.
So where do you get the resources when there's not just an infinite supply of labor or money that's going to come swooping in to support you?
It's that powerful and brutal question, which is, if I'm going to say yes to this, what do I need to say no to? A tough question, but how do you build courage in people to make those calls, to make those choices?
Boy, that's a tough one. I do think this is where it breaks down a lot of times. Like I was just thinking about Chip and I were years ago after the book Switch came out, we were invited to join this federal committee. They were overhauling the food pyramid, and we had poked fun at the food pyramid in Switch. And so they were kind of calling our bluff, like, okay, smart Alex, like, are you willing to help? Or are you just like throwing stones from the sidelines? And so we said, yeah, we'll help. And we had all these ideas, and most of them boiled down to what we're talking about right now, which is choosing something important and really pushing on it at the exclusion of other things. So, Chip and I were coming in with the mental model. Forget about a pyramid or, a hexagon. Like, we don't need any sort of shape. We don't need a hierarchy of foods. What we need is some actionable advice that will bear a lot of fruit for people. Like, what that would sound like is something like reducing sugary drink consumption, which is just a huge source of calories, no nutritional benefits. So that's a leverage point, right? So we're saying, we don't know what the perfect leverage point is. Let's bring in the nutritionist to help, but let's pick something and really push on that. We don't need to know grains and protein, and nobody thinks about their diet that way. Let's give them something to change that's tangible.
Right.
Well, back to your question. That's painful, right? Because everybody sitting around the table has like different axes to grind. And, there's some people at the table are like, well, I don't know if we can pick a fight with the soda companies, and, we want them to be on board. And, there's like a Weight Watchers person at the table that's like, well, it's all about the balanced diet. And we just come to realize, like, until we can develop the courage to pick one thing, like, the equilibrium is going to be, we're afraid of conflict. We're afraid to let someone run off disappointed. And so the only way to solve for a situation like that is to abstract to the point where everyone's kind of modestly happy, which is how you get the food pyramid, right? Nobody is offended by the food pyramid.
We're all slightly disappointed, but not terribly disappointed. And I can live with that disappointment.
It's like, okay, I can sign off on that harmless picture. But notice, like, the seeds of defeat are baked into that. It's like, if a bunch of people are like, shrug, okay, that's probably not something you're going to want to bet on as a hugely successful campaign.
So, my dear change leader, how are you when you look at yourself in the mirror about this important and difficult challenge, which is facilitating choice, which is actually, and I'll just say this more bluntly, facilitating courage? I mean, I know this deserves its own episode. We'll give it its own episode. But to master this key change competence, you really need to understand power and influence and negotiation and standing in your own power. Because this is about building the backbone to fight for a clear yes and therefore clear no's, and not settle, as we do so often in change, for the metaphorical equivalent of a mediocre food pyramid mishmash. Part of what I think the magic of your book Reset is you tell great stories and you tell real stories about real people. And you've been sharing those stories in our conversations. If you look at those characters that populate your book, what can we learn from them around what it takes to make those choices? What did you notice anything that they've got? Charm, or maybe just a hardened soul, or a psychopathic disregard to others?
Yes, ding, ding, ding. There's the one. I think one of the ahas for me was how often leaders that were successful were really tuned into unleashing motivation. And I want to draw a distinction here, because if you've been in change circles, you hear the phrase buy-in all the time. And it's like the mental model is, me and my collaborators, at the elevated levels of the organization are going to get together, come up with a really smart plan, and then we're going to come out and try to earn buy-in. And that's supposed to reflect enlightened thinking. But if you think about it, buy-in is just, I'm going to try to convince you to want what I want instead of what you want. That's buy-in. And I'm being a little cheeky. I mean, I do think there is a role for persuasion, obviously. But upstream of persuasion is just to say, what do you want today? Like, what do you think could be better? What would you change if you were made czar or czarina of the company? And can we kind of marshal those existing motivations and use that as effort to do work? I mean, it's as simple as that. So in the book, if you're listening and you can visualize a Venn diagram where one circle is what's required, that is what's required for change to succeed. And the intersecting circle is what's desired. Like, what do people already want to do today? And to the extent that there's any overlap between those two circles, there's your starting place.
It's other language around that is, what do you want and what do we need?
We're real good at this analytical process of like, where are we today? where are the shortcomings? Where do we want to be in a year or 2 years or whatever?
Yeah.
Let's map out the shortest line between the 2 points. And that all makes sense as an analytical process. But if you have left motivation out of that analysis, like you have inadvertently left out the single most important variable in the equation.
I love this,
right?
yeah.
Because if there's some winding, circuitous path from A to B that your people would be really fired up to do, you're crazy not to take it. Even if it's, technically longer and less direct than the one you hatched.
Yeah.
And made a lot of intellectual pristine sense. Because motivation is the turf of change.
Dan, for people who want more Dan Heath, more of your writing, more of your thinking, where do they find you in the world?
They can go straight to danheath.com and all the info about my books and my podcast, all right there.
Give us a sentence or two on what your podcast is about.
Oh, thank you for teaming me up there. Yeah, so I have a podcast called What It's Like to Be. And the conceit is in every episode, I talk to someone from a different profession. So I've talked to a Secret Service agent and a Christmas tree farmer and a daycare owner and a brain surgeon. And it is just fascinating to hear people talk about what moves them and what drives them crazy and what drew them to their respective fields.
People don't realize that the Secret Service agent and the Christmas tree farmer were the same person.
Yes. I mean, it was a real unlikely story there.
Dan, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Hey, thanks a million, Michael.
Look, I can't deny it. There was a little bit of fanboying going on there. Dan Heath. And honestly, he was as good as I'd hoped he'd be, probably better. He's such a good storyteller, isn't he? All while teaching and kind of laying out a clear, simple roadmap for change. If you do pick up his new book, Reset, and honestly, it is a terrific book, you might even see it as a meta lesson on how to design for change, because the book is clear, there's a compelling vision, there's a process that is not rigid but helpful. It's kind of a way of selecting what might work best. And there's less rather than more. I mean, it's a shorter book rather than a longer book. There's an economy and a distillation of what really matters. And any change program that could tick all of those boxes would be doing really well. Now, if this podcast is ticking your boxes, please leave it some love on your podcast platform of choice. I am so all in on growing the audience of this podcast to be an outstanding community of leaders of change. And your blurb, your support, your passing the word along really helps us find those other people. And I hope you also subscribe to our weekly newsletter at thechangesignal.com. Thank you. I'm glad you're here.